Good afternoon. First and foremost, I would like to say welcome and thank you so much for coming to our event today. This event is really about the history of the District of Columbia. In 1862, President Abraham Lincoln signed a bill and also issued the Emancipatory Act for the District of Columbia. And that was really the beginning of the end for slavery here in the United States. Of course, the Emancipation Compensatory Act was focused specifically on the District of Columbia. The district was the first place to become free. Here in DC, the owners of slaves were offered compensation totaling $300 for each slave that they freed. For those people who were freed and felt that they no longer wished to reside in the United States, the U.S. did indeed offer them compensation to emigrate to another country. So those who were former slaves that agreed to leave the United States were given $100 in compensation for their emigration. Now, 9 months after this bill took place here in the District of Columbia and was signed into law by Congress, Congress had the Board of Commissions, which received a petition and reviewed the petition and did indeed approve it, and then gave slaves the compensation. There were 2,989 former slaves that were freed through this process. It was an incredibly momentous day for people who had been living in slavery. It was a phenomenal rejoicing of freedom. And over the years, the African-American community here in DC has continued to celebrate the Emancipation Day of DC. It's an incredible experience, and I often wonder what it would have been like to be alive during those times, to have witnessed such an amazing experience. Now, before I do move on, I would like to introduce 3 distinguished guests here. We have a number of guests here who actually do need to leave shortly. President Hurwitz, he has a meeting here on campus, with Congress shortly, but he is here to join us briefly today. So hello, President Hurwitz. We also have from the DC Archives, Mr. Clarence Davis. If you could stand, Mr. Davis. He works with the Archives for the Federal Government of DC. We also have Mr. William Branch. If you could stand also to be recognized. Thank you, and now I would like to move on to some other introductions here. We have 2 MCs here with us today. They are students at Gallaudet University. The first is the Vice President of SPG, which is Brandon Williams. And we also have Delasha Singleton. She is the Director of Diversity for our student body government. She serves as mistress and master of our ceremonies here today. Let me introduce Delasha and Brandon to you. I'm very pleased to see everyone here today. As I was just introduced, I am Delasha. I am a senior here, and I work with the student body government. I'm Director of Diversity.
Good afternoon, and I'm Brendan Williams, and I'm also excited to be with you this afternoon. I'm the Master of Ceremonies and also a senior. It's an exciting time to be here at the university, and we've worked to watch this event come to pass. The Emancipation Act was passed, and to think about how to expand on that, I have no idea. Delasha, can you say more?
Yeah, I would say that if it weren't for this act, we might not be standing here on this stage right now. You might not be sitting in those seats right now. It was an incredibly impactful moment for all of us.
Indeed, it was. And as we go on, I'd like to, before we move forward, recognize today as the second day of Rosh Hashanah, a very high Jewish holiday.
Yes, so we would like to thank all of you who are celebrating Rosh Hashanah for joining us today.
Now, before we move on and have Mr. Gibbs give us our keynote address, we would like to recognize a few important guests here and invite our Provost, Dr. Stephen Weiner, to come forward. Yesterday was a very special day for me and my family as we celebrated Rosh Hashanah. And I'd like to say Happy New Year to all of you. And the way we say that is Lashona Tova. I'm very excited about this event. There is so much that we don't know about Washington, D.C. We have our distinguished speaker here today, and we're very delighted that you've taken the time out to be with us. Thank you for the support from our officials from the D.C. government as well. But I need to remind everybody that the emancipation of Washington, D.C. has yet to actually happen. D.C. has yet to be recognized as members with representation in Congress. It has not happened. It's still a colony. They cannot levy taxes or do anything without permission without the United States Congress. So I do hope that as we present today, we become more aware of these facts and the opportunity to promote the recognition of D.C. as an independent functioning government like any other city in the United States of America. It begins now with the speech that we'll hear today. Thank you, Dr. Gibbs, for coming, and we're very much looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you, Dr. Weiner, for your comments. We would also like to introduce the first Black deaf woman to earn a PhD degree in America. She is one of only 12 Black deaf women that hold a doctoral degree in the United States. Her sister also has a PhD. So without further ado, let me introduce to you Dr. Angela McCaskill. Welcome.
Thank you so much for that introduction, and welcome, everyone. It's really a pleasure to have all of you with us today. To commemorate the Emancipation Act of 1862, what an incredible opportunity. When I think about that, I realize this is a very historic moment for us. History in the making. And here at Gallaudet University, we were invited to Washington, D.C. when the city celebrated that back in April. We went to that event. So I'm happy to have you join us here today. I think about when Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Compensatory Act, and it was a very controversial act. Many people were not happy about that. The moment he signed that, 3,100 slaves took their first step to freedom. And that's not something that we can take for granted. That word freedom, what does it mean to us? When I reflect on what it meant then and what it means to us today, what an incredible moment. I'm often reminded of the famous historic quote from Dr. Martin Luther King. Dr. King said that the only way to really commemorate the emancipation of slaves is through our actions, through our reaffirmation of democracy. That's powerful. It's very powerful. So I thank you all for joining us today for this important celebration, and I do hope that you will participate in other programs and activities that we have scheduled. And we do have things for a full semester, not just one day. Please watch for more information, and thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much. Dr. McCaskill is our Chief Diversity Officer and works very closely with the President of the United States. Excuse me, the President of the University. We now would like to introduce to you C.R. Gibbs and tell you a little bit about this amazing man who's joining us today.
He's a well-known man. He's produced about 6 different books.
Yes, he has. He's published 6 different books. One is about Black inventors, and the other is about Black explorers.
Also, he has spoken in many, many different places throughout the United States, but not only throughout the United States, other countries, France, Belgium.
In 1989, he formed the American History Committee here, African American History here in DC, and has worked with a number of different groups. Can you help me out? Where has he's worked? He's lectured. He's been involved with churches, with libraries, and he's traveled around the United States giving various lectures. In 1997, he actually led 35 people across the continent of Africa, and I'm hoping that he'll perhaps share a little bit about that story with us today. It sounds fascinating.
Also, in 2009, he was honored by the Congressional Black Caucus Veterans Brain Trust because of all of the articles, exhibits, and presentations on the military heritage of African Americans and Africans that he's written.
So he is truly an amazing person and a wonderful figure to have here with us. We're so honored and look forward to hearing his comments today. Thank you all so much for joining us.
We are delighted, and his topic today is the triumph of freedom, slavery, emancipation, and the Civil War in the District of Columbia. Let's please give a warm Gallaudet welcome to C.R. Gibbs.
Good afternoon. Before I begin my formal remarks, I really would like to thank several people here without whose efforts I don't know that this day might have actually occurred. I want to begin, of course, with Clarence Davis and Bill Branch. I want to acknowledge the crucial assistance of Dean Palmer, the help of the interpreters, Candace and Adam and Jamie, and everyone that's played a role in any way, especially my new best friend, Ms. Christina Thompson. I want to thank her as well. So please give all of those folks I just named a round of applause if you would. My mission today is to give you a more deeper appreciation for and an awareness of slavery, emancipation, freedom, and the Civil War in the District of Columbia. And I want to do that by beginning with a story that's actually contained in the second of 3 autobiographies written by Frederick Douglass, the great African-American leader, editor, U.S. Marshal, a newspaper editor, abolitionist. In My Bondage and My Freedom, he writes about an event described to him by an old friend of his. The Honorable Seth M. Gates, an anti-slavery gentleman of the state of New York, a representative in the Congress of the United States, told me he saw this with his own eyes in the following circumstance. In the national capital, District of Columbia, over which the Star-Spangled Emblem is constantly waving, where orators are holding forth on the subject of American liberty, American democracy, American republicanism, there are 2 slave prisons. And he says he saw a young woman run out barefooted and bareheaded and with very little clothing on. She was running at all speed to the bridge he was approaching. His eye was fixed upon her, and he stopped to see what was the matter. He had not paused long before he saw 3 men run after her. He now knew what the nature of the case was. A slave escaping from her chains, a young woman, a sister, escaping from the bondage in which she had been held. She made her way to the bridge, but had not reached it ere from the Virginia side there came 2 slaveholders. As soon as they saw them, her pursuers called out, "Stop her!" True to their Virginian instincts, they came to the rescue of their brother kidnappers across the bridge. The poor girl saw that there was no chance for her. It was a trying time. She knew that if she went back, she must be a slave forever. She must be dragged down through scenes of pollution, which the slaveholders continually provide for most of the poor, sinking, wretched young women whom they call their property. She formed her resolution. And just as those who were about to take her were going to put their hands upon her, she leaped over the balustrades of the bridge, and down she went to rise no more. She chose death rather than to go back into the hands of those Christian slaveholders from whom she had escaped. This story is contained in Frederick Douglass's second autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, published in 1855. This, I hope, will give you an idea of some of the sacrifices, some of the heroism, some of the desperation that occurred right in the city in which you live. In this presentation, we will not discuss the crimes of the Deep South. No, we will concentrate on events and places right in your city, right where you live, right where you walk, ride, and luxuriate. Because it's important that you understand this hidden history that I'll share with you today. This is the real father of emancipation in the District of Columbia. His name is Senator Henry Wilson. He drafted the legislation that Lincoln signed in order to free the nearly 3,000 formerly enslaved people that would be freed under District of Columbia emancipation. And he noted in his book, and by the way, this arch foe of injustice and inequality, this enemy of slavery, died in the U.S. Capitol just as he was finishing this book. And in it he wrote, among the earlier victories of the slave power was the location of the national capital on the banks of the Potomac. By it, the government was located in a community averse to freedom, and the public men of the country were surrounded by an atmosphere tainted by the breath of the slave and by the blinding and perverting influences of slaveholding society. And even more significant and disastrous, still, the fact that the District of Columbia was placed under the special jurisdiction of Congress compromised the government and committed the nation to the existence and maintenance of slavery, giving it a pedigree, if not respectability, it could never have gained as a state institution. And so, dear friends, what I'm saying to you is that you must understand that from the very beginning, from the placement of this town between 2 slave states, it was a demonstration of the power of the slaveocracy. And this is some of what we'll study in this first part of the presentation. The place where the young woman leapt over the rail and chose death in the icy waters of the Potomac rather than a lifetime of slavery was just about where the 14th Street Bridge is today. We believe that the slave pen she ran from was located about 7th and Maryland Avenue Southwest. And if you know them all, you know where these places I just named were. But there are no signs and no plaques marking these locations, and yet there should be when you have such immense human suffering occurring in slave pens right on the edge of the mall. Here, if you've ever gone down and gone to the wharf, if you've ever had a hankering for fresh fish or fresh crabs, and you've gone down to the wharf, right on Main Avenue where those ships and boats are, right behind them, up on the hill behind the wharf, in the back of LaFont Plaza was one of the largest plantation houses in D.C. It's a plantation owned by a man named Notley Young. And he had, in the 1790s, more than 200 enslaved Africans on his plantation. So maybe the next time you're down at the wharf, maybe you get, again, that same hankering for crabs or fresh fish. I ask you to do something. In your mind's eye, turn around, look across Main Avenue, and look up that hill at the back of LaFont Plaza, and you'll be seeing where the site of the Notley Young house was. And perhaps you'll remember some of this hidden history that the district doesn't often tell you about. So this is how it was. This is the way in which the city began its economic life and vitality. From the book, Washington, A History of the Capital, by Constance M. Green. People born and bred in Maryland, Virginia, and farther south predominated in the new capital. Slavery was an inescapable, if somewhat unpleasant fact of life in the District of Columbia. In fact, white householders, irrespective of conscience, found themselves largely dependent on slave labor. Other than some of the free Negroes, virtually the only trained servants to be hired were slaves. Matter of fact, acceptance of slavery as an institution did not, however, reconcile many a district citizen to the domestic slave trade. It forced upon the residents and visitors a scene of wretchedness and human degradation, disgraceful to our character as citizens of a free government. And it would be this constant push and pull between slavery and freedom, between the exaltation of human dignity and the grotesque degradation of slavery, that would bring this country, indeed our city, to war. Let me take you to a couple of those hidden places. Has anyone here ever been to the Eastern Market Metro Station? If you have, then perhaps you've on your way to Eastern Market, or to walk in some of the bars and cafes along the hill. The next time you come out of the Eastern Market Metro Station, go around the back to D Street Southeast, right behind the back of the Eastern Market Metro Station. Walk halfway down the block, and on the sidewalk, you'll see Friendship House. Friendship House. It was, for many years, a social service agency. It was a place where even I, as a small lad, went to learn to read and to better my education. But there's a history to the Friendship House. The Friendship House was a slave plantation. Today, it is the last privately owned colonial period building on Capitol Hill. But all throughout its long life, built about 1795. From 1795 to 1862, its halls and chambers, its yards and stables rang with the lamentations of enslaved black people. And yet there's no marker to tell that story. No one to wipe the tears, no one to assuage the angst of what went on right on Capitol Hill. As a matter of fact, the diagram here in the upper right-hand corner, those are the slave quarters. Now, the slave quarters, and by the way, there were slave quarters also outside Friendship House. Now, in those days, it was known as the Maples or Maple Square. That's where I believe the slave quarters were. But they're getting ready to rehab the building. They're getting ready to change it. And now it will be known as the Maple Square condos, where from $400,000 to $1.65 million, you'll be able to buy a condo on the former site of a slave plantation. And again, we wonder, will the history be known? Those of you that have studied American Civil War history should know that when it was known as the Maples or Maple Square, many illustrious people went there. Among them, Senator Charles Sumner. And Charles Sumner told the owner of the place, who in the 1850s was a senator from Delaware, he said, keep the slave quarters, keep them up for posterity so that the trouble, so that the horror will never be forgotten. They didn't take his suggestion. What was it like in D.C., in the slave pens? Here we have a description from an English visitor who could not believe what he saw in the capital of the nation that professed itself to be the land of the free and the home of the brave. Join me. E.S. Abney, description of a Washington, D.C. slave pen. One day I went to see the slave's pen, a wretched hovel, right against the Capitol, from which it is distant about a half a mile, with no house intervening. The outside alone is accessible to the eye of the visitor. What passes within being reserved for the exclusive observation of its owner, a man of the name of Roby and his unfortunate victims. It is surrounded by a wooden paling, 14 or 15 feet high, with posts outside to prevent escape and separated from the building by a space too narrow to admit the free circulation of air. At a small window above, which was unglazed and exposed to light, to the heat of the summer and to the cold of the winter, so trying to the constitution, 2 or 3 sable faces appeared, looking out wistfully to while away the time and catch a refreshing breeze, the weather being extremely hot. In this wretched hovel, all colors except white, the only guilty ones, both sexes and all ages, are confined, exposed indiscriminately to all the contamination which may be expected in such society and under such seclusion. The inmates of this guile, of this class, I mean, are even worse treated, some of them, if my informants are to be believed, having actually been frozen to death during inclement weather, which often prevail in this country. While I was in the city, Roby had got possession of a woman whose term of slavery was limited to 6 years. It was expected that she would be sold before the expiration of that period and sent away to a distance where the assertion of her claim would be subject to ill usage. Cases of this kind are very common. This is the hidden history of the District of Columbia. This is the facts. These are the facts that we want to expose to you so that you can understand that the fight was long and difficult. If anybody has been to Brookland in Northeast, if you've gotten off the Catholic University Metro stop, if you walked over to Colonel Brooks Tavern and perhaps taken a beer or a small alcoholic libation of another kind, if you look across the street from Colonel Brooks Tavern, this building still stands. And it too was a slave plantation owned by the original, real Colonel Brooks. He had married into a large slave-owning family, one of the largest in the region. And when D.C. Emancipation, Compensated Emancipation came around, his wife and his sister-in-law's names would be on that list. And what about this place? How many of you recognize it? It's the old Washington City Hall. It's part of what is now the D.C. Court of Appeals. There were slave sales here from about 1820 to 1850. A large portion of the inhabitants of the district have petitioned that all children born of slaves in that district after the 4th of July, 1828, may be free at age 25. We sincerely hope that this petition will meet with favorable reception from the wise heads of the nation. There were those whites who were repelled by the sight of slave coffles coming through the streets of the district. In fact, passing by the U.S. Capitol. And they did what they could, but because of the power of the southern states, it was difficult to fight slavery in the nation's capital. And so you had slave pens like this, J.W. Neal, or Price Birch and Sons. Now, this building still stands in Alexandria, Virginia, of which was part of the district from about 1800 to about 1846. It's at 1315 Duke Street in Old Town, Alexandria. Today, it is the headquarters of the Northern Virginia Urban League. And if you called them and asked for a tour, they would take you down into the basement of this building, a basement which itself was the scene of so much misery and depravity and suffering that we cannot and should never forget what happened there. Franklin and Armfield were two of the largest slave traders in the region, in the district and Virginia. This is a manifest of one of their ships. They had 4 in which they bought and sold enslaved black men, women, and children. Bring them to D.C., bring them to Alexandria, and then ship them to Alabama, Louisiana, and even Texas. From my own collection, I have a bill of sale written by a man whose last name you might know if you're familiar with this area. His name was Charles Bowie. And if you've heard of Bowie State or Bowie, Maryland, that's the same family. They became rich off of horses, slaves, and tobacco. And here in my document, Charles Bowie is selling an 18-year-old African-American girl named Julia Johnson for $125. The stocks and branding irons, because in order for slavery to work, no matter where it was, in the North or the South, you had to be willing and able to use force. Brutality must be an ingredient in the brew of compulsion and control. And so in D.C., people were beaten, they were chained, they were whipped in the District of Columbia. And I especially want to share this with Clarence and Bill. For years, we thought that this painting was correctly called Old Kentucky Home, when it is actually an image painted of slavery in the District of Columbia, in downtown D.C. Negro Life at the South, a.k.a. erroneously known as Old Kentucky Home, is an 1859 painting by Eastman Johnson which depicts antebellum black life in Washington, D.C., and is based on his stays in the city between 1844 and 1858. As a result of political patronage, Johnson's father worked as a supervisor in the Navy Department and first owned a home at 266 F Street Northwest. This anti-slavery painting is based on an old frame building next to a later home of the artist's father, Philip Johnson, near the southwest corner of 13th and F Streets Northwest. But the South so liked this painting that it appropriated it, renamed it. And so that's how it became known as Old Kentucky Home, when it has nothing to do with Kentucky, and was painted in downtown D.C. And there's more here than you might think. As you move from right to left across the painting, we see in the far corner a young white woman entering. We believe that that is Eastman Someone had to fight and die for you to get that privilege. Please understand that. There's an old African-American hymn called "Somebody Prayed for Me." Somebody kept me on their mind. Somebody took the time to pray. You ought to understand, young folk, that that's coming out of an African ethos which our ancestors gave us so that we would understand that when we fight for justice, we're not just fighting for ourselves. We're fighting for those who are yet to come. We're fighting in the legacy of those who have gone on, and we stand at the nexus of all of these streams of life. There were emancipations in the district. This is a certificate of emancipation. By 1820, the number of freed blacks in the District of Columbia was larger than those of enslaved blacks. And we had our own freedom fighters. How many of you know the story of Miss Alethea Browning Tanner? I call her DC's own Harriet Tubman. And the reason I do that is because in her long life, she was born in the 1780s, I believe, and died in 1864. She was able to free several members of her own family from the proceeds of a vegetable garden. She raised vegetables in Anacostia, brought them across the bridge, and sold them in the park across the street from the president's house. According to some scholars, Thomas Jefferson was one of her customers. Patiently, dollar by dollar and dime by dime, she bought freedom for friends and family members. And because she lived until 1864, this black woman who had seen so much happen was able to enjoy that great day of jubilation, April the 16th, 1862. The brutality of district slavery angered many people. Let me give you one example in the writings that you can download this man's autobiography off the internet. His name is George Henry. And if you Google George Henry autobiography, it'll come up and you can read it yourself. But there's one thing. He was a sailor. He would pilot many ships. He knew the waters of the Potomac and the Patapsco as well as you know the veins on the back of your hand. But he was not prepared for what he would see one day when he came to the Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. My next voyage was to the Navy Yard in Washington with timber and wood. The captain told us boys that we might go up to see the Capitol, the center of this so-called free country. I've heard of it before and my eyes longed to see it. Under our journey onto the hill of the building, we heard such screaming and crying we couldn't tell what it meant. So we kept on until we met about 200 men and women chained together, 2 and 2. And there were some as pretty women and as fair as the sun ever shone upon, also the men. I, being a greenhorn, that means a person inexperienced, asked, "What does this mean?" And they told me they were being taken down to Alexandria to one of Armfield's vessels. They had a regular line and slave pen for New Orleans to be sold into slavery. And, sir, the scene was enough to bring tears to any man's eyes if he had a heart. When I saw that virtue was to be sacrificed to the highest bidder, I said then, away with your pretended free America. It is all a sham in my eye. It was then and there I made a vow never to come back to Washington unless I came with an army to take her or burn her down. They don't teach that in the history books. They don't show you the righteous indignation of those who saw the hideous face of slavery in the nation's capital close up. Square 115 on this map was the site of the permanent home of the school for free colored girls founded by an abolitionist named Myrtilla Minor. If you don't know her, here's a Yankee spinster, a woman who devoted her short life to the education of black children and who would never be forgotten. There's a minor elementary school in Northeast Washington and indeed a minor hall on the campus of Howard University. Her school, the last place it was in the wilds of, in the 1850s, in the wilds of an area of town that would come to be known as DuPont Circle. And in DuPont Circle, at this school, The school was attacked by bullies and robbers. The students were attacked on to and from school. She and one of her assistants had to practice pistol shooting in the front yard in order to keep the bullies away. We're lucky to have the diary of a free black man who lived before slavery, or rather before the Civil War. His name is Michael Shinner, and he worked at the Washington Navy Yard. And this is what his diary says. On the 5th day, June 1833, on Monday, my wife and children, Phyllis Shiner, were sold to a couple of gentlemen, Mr. Franklin and Mr. Armfield, and were carried down to Alexandria on the 6th day of June, 1833. On Thursday, the 7th of June, 1833, on Friday, I went to Alexandria 3 times in one day over the Long Bridge, and I were in great distress. Can you imagine? He worked at the Navy Yard. He lived near Eastern Market. He got up one morning, kissed his children, hugged his wife, took his lunch. And yet when he came back, his entire family was gone. You don't ever have to know anything about slavery to understand and empathize with someone who suffered such a sudden, unexpected loss. And remember, his children, his wife had done nothing to merit being taken out of his home, taken across the river, and put on the auction block. But that's the way things were in the District of Columbia before the Civil War. Imagine one other thing. How those of you that know the district well, imagine walking from Eastern Market across the 14th Street Bridge to Alexandria, not once, not twice, but 3 times in one day. Incredible. Couldn't see his family. He was not allowed to. And here's what he says. He finishes the passage but says, but nevertheless, with the assistance of God, I got my wife and children clear. First of all, he was undeniably lucky. And yes, it was with the assistance of God, but also with the help of many people, because he had to collect money. He had to ransom his own family in order to get them back into his arms. That's the way it was in the District of Columbia. One place that you could go for respite, a haven for your soul, a boiling pot of liberty for the black churches. And here's one that I hope you're familiar with, St. Augustine's Black Catholic Church, the oldest black Catholic congregation in the District of Columbia. It's for many years at 1150 15th Street Northwest. Today, 1150 15th Street Northwest is the site of the Washington Post. But at least they have a plaque on the building. And St. Augustine's has moved uptown to about 15th and B Streets Northwest. In 1848, the largest mass escape attempt by water in the history of the Underground Railroad occurred in Washington, D.C. It's known as the Pearl Affair, where 77 enslaved men, women, and children tried to escape to freedom. They were unsuccessful, but it is a reminder of how strong the desire for freedom was, even in the District of Columbia. Let's take a look at this advertisement. Runaway Tabitha, age 10, has mother in the Alexandria workhouse. The little slave girl who calls herself Margaret. Understand, that's resistance, y'all. You refuse to be tied. You refuse to be limited. Somebody calls you, name your. At the age of 10, has been on the auction block, had 3 different owners by the age of 10. She must have been a handful. She still showed spirit by running away from her current owners, who are offering a $30 reward for her return. When you think about the runaway, the Underground Railroad, when you think about the history of the escapes from liberty, remember they were not confined just to adults, but to teenagers, to the disabled, to young people. Here's another runaway advertisement. $30 reward, my Negro man commonly called John Gray. And as you read it, you can see there's specific identification, But look at the clothing he took with him: a blue broadcloth coat, black velvet collar. He took coats and pants, 3 pairs of trousers. I have to believe that one of those was going to be his party when he went north to freedom. Okay? He was going to party like it was 1859 when he got to be free. And here's one. Run away from the subscriber living in Bladensburg on Saturday the 6th instant. A Negro woman named Aggie of common size, dark copper color, straight and well made. Her feet and ankles are made more like a white woman's than a Negro. I have no idea what that means. But the important thing is look at what she takes with her. She has a variety of clothing with her, among which is 2 white and dark striped homemade woolen frocks, new shoes of good quality, and generally wears a handkerchief around her head. The handkerchief, the head wrap, which has been part of the joy and grace, the splendor of black women since time immemorial. We still see echoes of that even in the slave trade condition. And notice when the so-called experts on slavery, and notice that when the so-called experts on slavery said if a black person ran away, they were suffering from a disease. That they didn't do it because they thought of it. They were compelled by some microbe, some angry molecule. The disease was called drapetomania, the disease of running away. Now, of course, we don't believe that, but the slave owners had to come up with some reason. They had to provide some justification, no matter how shallow, no matter how hollow it was, to describe this. And so they said, well, they're suffering from a disease. And, they get up and they don't plan. They get up and they don't think. They just run off. But we see that that's not the case here. For what? She took clothing so she could disguise her personal appearance. And what else is crucial? Our sister took new shoes of good quality. I don't think I need to say anything else. Okay. I've got to share this young lady with you. This is from 1783. And it's a runaway poster. One away from the 29th of July, 1783, from the subscriber living in Prince George's County, near the woodyard. A short, thick mulatto wench named Phyllis, 30 years of age, hath a large scar on one of her cheeks. And let's go down here. 2 years ago, she ran away. So she's a repetitive runaway. And she uses aliases. Noto bene, note well, this same wench was sold for running away and hath been very troublesome to me. She is a great liar and a rogue and is artful in passing with many idle tales in her own neighborhood, pretending to be sent about my business and at the same time is run away. She hath made away with several articles of my property for her own. They are too tedious to mention. Therefore, I desire all manner of persons to have no manner of dealings with her, nor to harbor her 1 hour, except by my note from this day forward. It makes you wonder why he wanted her back. But this is the essence of the desire to be free, that no obstacle could not be scaled. No ditch could not be crossed in the name of freedom. Or as my good friend Clarence Davis says, in the name of freedom, justice, and equality. If you've ever been on the red line and you've gotten off at Judiciary Square at the Law Enforcement Memorial, you'll come up, out, and looking at a building called the Pension Building or the National Building Museum. Well, before that building was there, the Washington City Jail was there, a place where unlucky captured runaways were incarcerated. It was known as the Blue Jug. So that the increasing discord over slavery versus freedom captured the nation's attention, a reluctant nation's attention, I might add. And one of the greatest of the abolitionist newspapers was The Liberator, published by William Lloyd Garrison. But I would have you know this, that if you looked at the masthead of the newspaper, because of the primacy of the issue of slavery in the District of Columbia, of wide-scale oppression in the nation's capital, look at the masthead on the left side. It contains a slave sale in the District of Columbia. How do we know? The Capitol's in the background, and a flag flying from the central rotunda. Well, this could not go on forever. The increasing discord and harmony, the jangling discord between the North and the South would ultimately erupt into a civil war about the first week of April 1861 at Charleston, South Carolina. And so the long war, the irrepressible conflict had begun. And this is how it was reported in a local D.C. newspaper. Sumner attacked, conflict at Charleston, breach in the fort reported. D.C. would become a nest of forts. More than 60 forts would be built around the nation's capital, including several right out Bladensburg Road. For example, Fort Lincoln, the site of a cemetery. If you've never been to Fort Lincoln Cemetery, if you were to go one day, drive to the right up on the highest hill, the remains of Fort Lincoln, built during the American Civil War. So 60 forts around the district. But there's also something that is irritating to the power structure in the city. Hundreds of black folk escaping from Virginia begin to come into the city. Now, there's no talk yet of emancipation, but there's going to be. And this is on the right-hand side is the response of the District of Columbia City Council. The sentiment of a large majority of the people of this community is averse to the unqualified abolition of slavery in the district at the present critical juncture. Located as it is between two slaveholding states, they don't want to turn it into an asylum for free Negroes, a population undesirable in every American community. The D.C. City Council doesn't want that for Washington. But it's going to happen nonetheless. This is a description of how Lincoln came to sign the document drafted by Senator Henry Wilson. And finally, on April 16th, 1862, there will be emancipation in the district. The act entitled An Act for the Release of Certain Persons Held to Service or Labor in the District of Columbia has this day been approved and signed. And this is a copy of the first part of the actual legislation. Now, there's something different. This is no presidential fiat. This is, however, the only instance of compensated emancipation in the history of the United States. Compensated emancipation. No, the slaves don't get a penny, but the masters do. And each slave owner that wishes to be compensated has to fill out a petition listing the names and value of every enslaved person under his or her control. Then they have to sign it. Okay? And that's sent off to the commissioners and published. There are about 900 claimants. $1 million is set aside. There's also a stipulation by Lincoln that for colonization, so that once black folk in the district are freed, they must leave. That dies. But here, for example, is a page of the list of petitioners with the names of the slave owners and the amounts that they invoiced for. And on these lists, among these 900 names, are about 9% African American. These are like Gabriel Coakley, who has managed by hook or crook to buy members of his family because that was the only way he could keep them together. This is how slavery forces people to try and get around the system. This is the account of D.C. Emancipation Day by Christian A. Fleetwood, a Civil War soldier, a newspaper editor of Baltimore, and a black Congressional Medal of Honor winner during the Civil War. He reports how the news poured through the homes in the district, how people were so happy, how a woman says, I must go and pray and say that Jesus has done all things well. It's a time of unalloyed joy. Among D.C.'s largest slave owner, a man named George Washington Young. He lived across the river in Anacostia along the branch of the Eastern Bank. about where Bowling Air Force Base is. And he had 69 enslaved men, women, and children. And he received $17,000, an amount worth more than $40,000 today. There were those slave owners who also ran the slaves out of the district rather than free them. That's another untold aspect of D.C. emancipation. Not everybody got out. Not everybody was free. There were some people who were kept inside and smuggled to other parts of the country. Then on December 31st, 1862, we have Watch Night, a watch night tradition that changes how black people watch. Prior to that time, if they were in a Protestant church, it had simply been the coming of the new year. But now there was a new dawn of freedom. For January 1st, 1863 was the date of the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, Lincoln didn't do it because he was a friend of black people. He didn't do it because he liked black people. Ultimately, the real reason for the Emancipation Proclamation was the enlistment of black men, more than 200,000. And the country, North and South, would, as W.B. Du Bois said, would be forever rocketed by those 622 words in the Emancipation Proclamation. The political trigonometry of the country would be changed for all time. But this document would allow black men to fight fully, formally, and freely for the country. And they would help save this country. They would abolish slavery and restore democracy. From our own city, the 1st Regiment, United States Colored Troops, not well known of today, but it's been my honor to write the first book ever on the Black Civil War Regiment from the district. I understand we'll have copies in another part of the campus after the presentation. They fought in Virginia and North Carolina. Sojourner Truth came to D.C. to work with the thousands of blacks that came to the city seeking shelter and refuge. Thousands more worked on forts and military structures all around the area. And when D.C. emancipation became widely known, place after place, in this case New York City, acknowledged that D.C. emancipation was the death knell of slavery nationally. After the war, this is the first celebration of D.C. emancipation in 1866. A popular stop on the D.C. Emancipation Day parades was Lincoln Park on East Capitol Street, southeast between 11th and 13th Streets. A popular D.C. Emancipation Day speaker, Frederick Douglass, who I might add became aware of slavery in the nation's capital while he was stealing an education in Baltimore. One of the things he read about. D.C. Emancipation Day was the preeminent social holiday in the city for black people. Anniversary of emancipation. This is 1886. There were parades, dances, socials. But of course, there also got to be some fighting between different factions. This is a headline from Emancipation Day services at the Vermont Avenue Baptist Church, which still stands on Vermont Avenue Northwest, from 1900. From 1902, in a parade that stretched parts of it from Georgetown to Lincoln Park. Here is an Emancipation Day headline that highlights many of the leaders of D.C. emancipation. This is an article I wrote for the Washington Post talking about how Emancipation Day was noted for 35 years from 1866 to 1901, and there was a parade marking the freeing of about 3,000 formerly enslaved people. 1916, D.C. Emancipation Day honored. 1926, D.C. Emancipation Day honored. 1927, the Colored Oldest Inhabitants Association will have a banquet Wednesday. Negroes of the Capitol observe Emancipation Day. 1936, Emancipation observed. 1940. And then in 1962, the 100th anniversary of D.C. emancipation. There was a ceremony on Capitol Hill. Children from McKinley High School came and performed. Then in the 1990s, as a result of the Herculean efforts of Loretta Carter Haynes, the celebration which had died down was renewed again. And then in 2010, President Obama honors Washington, D.C. Emancipation Day. Thanks to individuals in the District of Columbia government, such as Clarence Davis and William Branch, there have been a series since the 90s of commemorative efforts, educational efforts, and today, of course, parades, so that we never forget the battle it took to end slavery in the nation's capital. And I would have you consider one other thing as we move to the close. There are descendants today whose ancestors were freed on April 16, 1862. They still live in the city. What does it all mean? How does it all play out? What is the significance of D.C. emancipation? I end with this image and the words quoted by the New York Times, but from the London Times. The 16th of April, 1862 was a day which will stand in American history as the greatest day since that of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The day of this century which will be honored through all time, whatever may be the destiny in store for the Republic. When the traditions of sea and land victories are becoming dim, when the grass has grown high on the graves of fallen heroes, that day will stand highest in the scale of national festivals. On that day, the people of the United States ceased to be a slave-holding nation. Till then, there had been a gulf fixed between them and all those Christian nations which had outgrown the barbarism of holding men as slaves. And now the nation has come over to the side on which we stand. It has abolished slavery on the national territory, and the national government has ceased to be a slave-holding power. Slavery has sunk to a mere state institution. Its doom is plain, its strength is broken. The meaning then of D.C. emancipation, of which you celebrate on this day today, is that this was the first step on a freedom road, a road that would lead from April 16th, 1862 to June 19th, 1862, in which Lincoln would end slavery in the Western Territories. In September of 1862, he would author the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. January 1st, 1863, the effective date of the original Emancipation Proclamation. And then the work is still not done. You see, because now comes Juneteenth, June 19th, 1865. And then, at the end of that year, the 13th Amendment and chattel slavery is finally and forever ended in the United States. But the battle for the district is not yet won. We do not have the vote. We cannot speak for ourselves. Our representative is constrained, if you will. And so for us, as citizens of the district, we can take pride in this history, knowing that the story is not over, that the final chapter is not yet written. And so it remains to us to realize the hopes, the aspirations of all of those who went before us, all of those who saw in their actions and hoped in ours for a new and better day of freedom, equality, and justice in the nation's capital. Thank you very much.
So now we'd like to take a moment for questions and answers. If you have questions, please do come forth. We'd like to have one person come at a time. And please come to the stage so everybody has an opportunity to see you and ask away. Any questions? No questions? Going once? Going twice? All right.
I believe we have one question from the audience here. I think I have a number of questions, but trying to get them all put together to come up here and ask them is a little bit difficult for me. But first of all, let me start by saying thank you so much by joining us today for this celebration of Emancipation Day. I was wondering, now you said as a young child you yourself went to the Friendship House, correct? And so I was actually wondering where your passion for this study and learning and lecturing and writing and all of that that you've done with your life, that you've made a career of, and what's become your daily passion, does that come from something that specifically started this for you? Was there an instance or a trigger in your life that led you to find this career, or was it simply something that you were interested in and then it led you into a career? You know, and to be able to make a career and a life and a living out of this is just amazing. So I'm just wondering if you could share a little bit about that experience for yourself. Oh, yeah, I get that. Absolutely. I understand that.
I attribute it to the elders and the ancestors guiding me, that it was something that they put in me, and whenever I tried to do something else, I was brought back to that path. I began to realize it in junior high school, when instead of being out on the playground with the other kids, I'd be inside in the library reading.
Yeah, I could get that. Very great. Thank you so much for sharing.
Any other questions?
Hello. Let me find out where the best place to stand is so everyone can see me okay. Thank you, first of all, for your lecture today. It was truly inspiring to, oh, hold on, let me rearrange. Can everyone see me now? Okay, once again, thank you so much. My family is from Washington, D.C., so listening to your thoughts today is incredible. You know, my family has been here for generations, and we've lived just about 10 minutes from where we are right now. So these stories are so amazing, and there's so many pieces that we don't know or that have been forgotten or lost in history and aren't documented. You know, you're talking here about the number of famous houses and buildings that have a history of slavery behind them that are not recognized. There are no plaques. There is nothing to show that history. Is there something that's taking place now, or is there some sort of movement that we could support to allowing plaques to be placed, or so that history is shown in a number of different places in these historical landmarks? You know, is there something that I could myself do? Could I write a letter or write to the newspaper or something? Is there any advice for us here in the audience, that those of us who live in DC and that would like to support a change in terms of recognizing and remembering this history, so that people can go and see these places and know what lies behind it, what those rich stories are? Is there anything that we can do?
May I make 3 recommendations? The first
Absolutely.
is that you collect your family history so that is documented, first and foremost, so that if you pass along nothing else, you pass along the struggles, particularly of the ancestors that lived 100 years or more back, that you pass those on, okay? The second thing I would recommend is that you support efforts such as those of the DC government through Clarence Davis and Bill Branch that have a website that we're going to have a ceremony every year for district emancipation. So, and particularly next year, where we're celebrating the 150th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And of course, this year we're celebrating the 150th anniversary of DC emancipation. Let that be a continuum by which you commit yourselves and members of your family that have an interest to learn more about the history of the city. So the first thing, family history. Second thing, city history. And the third and final thing is that when you do research on your neighborhood, learn about your neighborhood so that if you can tell the stories, that means you got to spend time with the old folk because they're the only ones that know. Because if you look for the professionals, that is to say the tourist board's not going to do that. But it is important for you. So if you'll keep those three things in mind, that'll go a long way to preventing the kinds of historical loss that we're undergoing, and which was, if I could say, recently chronicled, yesterday, in the Washington Post about 8th Street and the loss of another important black business. And that with the renaming of parts of our city, the black heritage is being lost, as I often say to my friends, brick by brick and yard by yard every day. And the one way we can stop it, we can't always control the politicians, but we can control ourselves.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Actually, this will be our final question. Oh, no, then no, I'm not going to do this. You come up.
Can we do two finals?
Can we do?
Can we do two? Can we do the last two? Okay. All right.
I'm wondering how you found all this information to document it. All of this knowledge that you have, this historical knowledge, where have you found it?
I never stop looking. There's not well, my wife knows this very well. It's hard for me to go on a vacation. I'm researching constantly. I'm researching constantly. That's how I found about the portrait that I showed, the painting. For years, people thought that was about someplace in Kentucky, and that was right in downtown Washington, D.C. I didn't know that, and I had seen the painting and did not know the history behind that painting of the so-called old Kentucky home, which is actually in D.C. So I'm always looking. I simply never stop researching. I'll get up in the middle of the night and work on stuff. And so I write, newspaper articles, books, and things.
At some point, do you intend to collect all of that information and create a repository, a book, something that we can go and refer to for all of it?
Well, thank you. Let me do a shameless commercial. Again, for those of you that have an interest, I'm signing my books in someplace else on campus today, as soon as we finish here. And I will be donating my collection. I've donated 135 pieces of African-American show business memorabilia to Howard University. And so I will be donating more to Howard and to the Smithsonian.
Please keep it up.
Thank you so much. Thank you all for coming today. Again, we are going to now move over to the multipurpose room for a reception and also the book signing. Any final words, Brandon?
Thank you for coming, everyone.